The folded piece of paper hit the table between them like a gunshot. Nellie Ralston stared at it, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the soles of her worn leather boots pressed flat against the floorboards. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters of the Donnelly Ranch house, and somewhere in the far distance a coyote called out across the darkening New Mexico Territory sky. She did not look up. She could not look up, because if she did, she would have to face what was written on that paper. She would have to face what Micah Donnelly had done. "When were you going to tell me?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended, stripped of everything except the raw truth of betrayal. Micah stood on the other side of the table, his jaw set, his dark eyes steady in that infuriating way he had, like the whole world could catch fire around him and he would simply remain. He was still wearing his work clothes, dust on his collar, a faint crease of exhaustion around his eyes, and his hat was in his hands, turning slowly by the brim the way it always did when he was choosing his words carefully. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. "Tonight." She finally looked up, and the emotion in her chest pressed outward like a dam against floodwater. "You were going to tell me tonight, after you already filed the paperwork, after you already talked to Reverend Holt, after you already—" Her voice cracked and she hated it, hated the way it gave her away. She had spent her entire life making sure nothing gave her away. "After you made permanent plans, Micah." He did not flinch. He never flinched. That was one of the first things she had noticed about him, back when she had been nobody to him except a temporary arrangement, a practical solution to a problem neither of them had wanted to have. She had not been supposed to fall in love with him. And she was furious, not only at him, not only at the paper on the table with its careful, deliberate ink, but at herself, because somewhere between arriving at this ranch with her 2 battered bags and her absolute certainty that she would be gone by the end of the month, she had stopped being able to imagine leaving. The paper between them read, "Marriage license application, filed with the clerk of Doña Ana County. Names, Micah Thomas Donnelly and Nellie Grace Ralston." He had filed it 4 days after she arrived. She had been there for 6. "Sit down, Nellie," he said quietly. "Don't you dare tell me to sit down in a house I was never supposed to, please." The word was different from him, softer. It stopped her. "Please sit down and let me explain from the beginning, because if you're going to hate me for this, I'd rather you hate me for the truth than for what you're assuming." She sat down, not because he asked, because her legs had started to shake and she refused to let him see that too. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the shutters, and Micah Donnelly began to talk. It had started, as most complicated things in the New Mexico Territory started in the year 1878, with a letter. The Santa Fe Trail was changing. The railroad was pushing its iron fingers across the territory with a relentlessness that was reshaping everything. The trade routes, the towns, the fortunes of men who had spent decades building something on the land. Micah Donnelly had built the Crescent Ridge Ranch over 11 years of backbreaking, solitary work. He had arrived in Doña Ana County at 22 with nothing except a small inheritance from his father, a talent for reading land and water, and a stubbornness that bordered on a character flaw. By 33, he had 400 acres, a profitable cattle operation, and a ranch house that was, by any honest measure, too large for one man. He had never minded the solitude. He had, in fact, counted on it. His dark past with trust, with the particular kind of trust that involved letting someone inside the walls he had spent years building, had made him careful, cautious. The people in Mesilla, the nearest proper town, 12 miles down a dry red road from Crescent Ridge, considered him a decent man, a fair man, a quiet man who paid his debts, kept to himself, and never caused trouble at the saloon because he rarely entered it. They did not know about Alina. Nobody in Doña Ana County knew about Alina, and Micah intended to keep it that way. What had forced his hand, what had cracked open the Loctite routine of his solitary life, was his younger brother's catastrophic letter, which arrived in early September of 1878 on a Tuesday when the sun was high and brutal and Micah was fixing a section of fence along the eastern pasture. His ranch hand, a quiet, competent Mexican man named Rogelio Vargas who had been with Micah for 6 years, had ridden out with the mail from town. Micah had tucked most of it into his vest pocket without reading it and finished the fence post. Then he'd ridden back to the house, made coffee on the iron stove, and sat down at the kitchen table to sort through the week's correspondence. The letter from his brother Daniel was at the bottom of the stack. Daniel Donnelly was 26, lived in Abilene, Kansas, and had the particular talent of making every problem in his life sound both urgent and someone else's fault. Micah had long since developed a kind of fond, exhausted tolerance for his brother's disasters, but this letter was different. Micah read it twice, then set it down and stared at the far wall for a long moment. Daniel had gotten himself into serious debt with a man named Cortland Webb, a cattle broker whose legitimate business was a thin layer of respectability over a much darker operation. Webb had extended Daniel credit on a cattle deal that went badly, and now Daniel owed Webb $400, an enormous sum, with interest compounding at a rate that suggested Webb had never seriously intended to be repaid in cash. What Webb wanted, the letter made clear in Daniel's frightened, rambling handwriting, was information about Crescent Ridge. Webb had been quietly buying up land in Doña Ana County, pressuring ranchers to sell, and the Donnelly spread sat directly across the best water source for 30 miles. Webb wanted to know if Micah could be pressured. He wanted Daniel to find out. Daniel, to his credit, had refused, and now Webb's men had made certain threats. Micah folded the letter carefully and placed it in the locked tin box he kept under the floorboard in the bedroom. Then he walked outside, stood on the porch in the late afternoon heat, and thought. He had dealt with men like Cortland Webb before. He knew that what Webb was doing, the debt trap, the hidden motive disguised as legitimate business, the slow squeeze on landowners, was a technique as old as greed. Webb could not simply take Crescent Ridge. He would need Micah to either sell under duress or become vulnerable enough that the law or some manufactured scandal could strip him of the deed. The way to neutralize that particular trap, Micah had learned from painful experience, was to remove any leverage Webb might find. And Webb's men, according to Daniel's letter, had already begun asking questions in Mesilla. Questions about Micah's personal life. Questions about whether there was anyone he was close to who might be used. There was nobody. Micah had made certain of that. But Daniel had mentioned, in the letter, that Webb's man had specifically noted that Micah's isolated status was itself a vulnerability. That a single man on a large property, with no family nearby, could be made to disappear without the kind of immediate outcry that a family man would generate. Micah sat with that for a long time. It was Rogelio who mentioned it first, the following morning over coffee, in the practical, unvarnished way that Rogelio had of addressing uncomfortable realities. There were women in the territory, Rogelio said carefully, who advertised in newspapers back east, women looking for a respectable situation. Some of them were running from something. Some were just practical about what the frontier offered. It was a common enough arrangement, a contract. Time limited if both parties agreed. Enough to establish a presence, a household, a visible domestic situation that would make Micah look less like a solitary target. Micah had said he would think about it. He thought about it for exactly 1 day. Then he wrote the advertisement and sent it to a newspaper in St. Louis, because St. Louis was far enough away that no one would know anyone and close enough that a woman could reach New Mexico territory within a reasonable time by train and stage. He was looking for a housekeeper. The advertisement was careful about this. It offered fair wages, a private room, a defined term of 3 months, and described the work honestly. It did not advertise for a wife. Micah was not looking for a wife. He received 11 responses in 3 weeks. 10 of them he discarded for reasons that were clear enough on reading. 2 were very clearly not what they claimed. 3 were looking specifically for marriage rather than employment, and several had letter styles that suggested they had not read the advertisement carefully. The 11th response gave him pause. The handwriting was neat and controlled, with a precision that suggested someone educated. The sentences were direct. The letter stated her age, 27, her situation, recently arrived in St. Louis after leaving Kansas City, where she had been employed as a school teacher until the school board had dismissed her for reasons she described only as political differences with the board chairman and her requirements: fair pay, honest work, and no misrepresentation about the nature of the arrangement. She had also written at the bottom of the letter a single line that Micah had read 3 times. "I am not looking for permanence. I have had enough of being someone else's permanent plan. I want honest work and clean air and to be left to my own thoughts when the day is done." He had written back the same afternoon. Her name was Nellie Grace Ralston. She arrived at the Mesilla Stage Depot on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of September 1878, when the air smelled of dust and dried sage, and the light came down at that low golden angle that made everything in New Mexico look like it was painted on the inside of a cathedral. Micah was waiting with the buckboard wagon. He had told himself, during the 12-mile drive into town, that he was doing this purely as a practical measure. He would maintain a professional distance. The arrangement was temporary. It was a solution to a specific problem, and when the problem was resolved, the arrangement would end, and they would both move on with their respective lives. He watched Nellie Ralston climb down from the stage, and he revised exactly nothing. She was exactly what her letter had suggested: composed, clear-eyed, no nonsense in the way she collected her bags, and looked around the depot with the focused attention of someone taking stock rather than admiring scenery. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical traveling hat, and the kind of face that was striking not because of any single feature but because of the intelligence behind it, the watchfulness, the sense that she was thinking several things simultaneously and choosing which to show you. She spotted him. He was the only man standing alone holding a wagon, and walked directly over. "Mr. Donnelly," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it. "Miss Ralston, you had a good journey. The last stage was crowded and the road from Las Cruces is badly maintained. I had a fine journey otherwise." She looked at the wagon. "How far is the ranch?" 12 miles. "Then we'd better start before it gets dark." They had barely spoken on the drive. Not from hostility, from a mutual, tacit agreement that there was nothing useful to say in a buckboard rattling over hard-packed road in the early evening, with the desert spreading orange and purple in every direction. Micah had pointed out landmarks as they passed them. She had looked where he pointed. When they arrived at Crescent Ridge and she stepped down into the lamplight of the ranch yard, she had turned and looked at the house, solid, well-built, larger than necessary, and said, with a tone that was not quite approval but was something close to it, "You built this yourself." "Most of it with help." "It shows," she said. "The joints are good." He had not expected that. The first week was careful. Careful and strange and charged with a kind of quiet electricity that Micah could not fully account for, and therefore chose to ignore. Nellie settled into the household with a methodical competence that was, in its own way, astonishing. She did not try to change everything at once. She assessed first, moved through the kitchen and the pantry and the cellar with the quiet thoroughness of someone taking an inventory, and then began making systematic improvements that were so logical, so clearly right, that Micah found himself wondering how he had managed without them. She reorganized the pantry on the first day so that staple goods were accessible and perishables were correctly stored. On the second day, she found the problem with the kitchen stove's flue that had been causing it to smoke and fixed it herself with a bent piece of tin and a length of wire. On the third day, she rode out on the smaller of the 2 horses without asking permission, which he noticed, and came back in the late afternoon with a basket of dried herbs she had identified along the creek bed, and spent the evening hanging them from the kitchen ceiling in neat bundles. She cooked without fuss and ate without ceremony. She kept her private room tidy and did not leave her things anywhere they were not supposed to be. In the evenings she read. She had brought 4 books in her bags, which he thought was either extravagant or exactly right depending on your view of books, and she did not expect conversation. He watched her, in the way a man watches something he is trying not to find interesting. On the 4th evening, the situation changed. He had ridden into Messilla that afternoon to see about some supplies and had stopped at the land office, where the clerk, a nervous, round-faced man named Abernathy, had pulled him aside and told him, in a low voice that suggested he knew more than he was comfortable with, that a man had been in asking questions. A well-dressed man. He'd asked specifically about Micah's deed records, about any liens or disputes on the Crescent Ridge property, and then he'd asked whether Micah was married. Micah had ridden home with that information sitting in his chest like a coal. He had sat at the kitchen table that evening after supper and stared at the lamp flame for a long time, and then he had looked at Nellie across the table with her book open, her second cup of coffee cooling beside her, and he had made a decision that he knew, even as he made it, was going to complicate everything. "I need to be honest with you about something," he said. She had looked up from her book with those steady, watchful eyes. "All right." Told her about Webb, about Daniel's letter, about the specific vulnerability that Webb was probing. He did not tell her about Alina. That was a different category of dark past, one that he was not ready to open, not yet, maybe not ever, but he told her enough that she understood the shape of the problem. Nellie had listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she closed her book and set it on the table. "So you need Webb to believe you're not alone," she said. "Yes. And that's part of why you placed that advertisement." It was not quite a question. He nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "You could have said so in the letter." "I wasn't sure when I wrote the letter what I needed. I thought a housekeeper would be sufficient. Now I'm not certain it is." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to lie. I'm not asking you to pretend to anything you aren't. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be seen in town with me, to be introduced when the occasion arises as a member of this household. That's all." "A member of this household," she repeated. "Yes. Not a wife." "No." She had looked at him for a long moment with that expression. He was beginning to recognize the one that meant she was weighing something, and would give you her honest conclusion regardless of whether it was convenient. Then she said, "I'll think about it." She thought about it overnight. In the morning over coffee she said, "I'll do it, but the terms of the original arrangement stand. 3 months, fair pay, clean work. And when Webb is handled and you don't need the arrangement anymore, I leave on good terms with a reference letter." "Agreed," he said. And that, Micah would later understand, was the exact moment he began making plans he had not yet admitted to making. It was the way she had said, "I'll do it." Not as a concession, not as a negotiation. As a decision, made on her own terms, after her own consideration, by a woman who had apparently spent years having people make decisions for or about her, and had finally arrived at a place where she simply did not allow that anymore. He found that extraordinary. He found her extraordinary, and he spent approximately 3 days trying very hard not to find either of those things remarkable before he gave up the pretense entirely, at least internally. Outwardly he remained exactly what he had established himself to be. Careful, professional, respectful of the distance they had both agreed to maintain. He also, on the 4th day of her being at Crescent Ridge, walked into the county land office while Abernathy was at lunch and looked at the marriage license application form. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and walked out. He told himself he was just being thorough. They went into Messilla together for the first time on a Friday, 5 days after her arrival. It was market day, which meant the town's single main street was busy with people, wagons, horses, the smell of dust and horses, and the dry goods store's particular combination of coffee and leather and pickled things. Nellie wore a dark blue dress that was practical and clean and fit her well, and she walked beside him with the same composed, direct energy she brought to everything. asking questions about the town with the interest of someone actually learning geography rather than making small talk. He introduced her to 3 people they encountered. The blacksmith Jonas Prout, who was a straightforward and decent man and shook Nellie's hand with straightforward decency. The dry goods owner's wife, Clara Vance, who was warm and curious and invited Nellie to the Thursday sewing circle with an enthusiasm that was genuine and also transparently reconnaissance. And the sheriff, a lean, weathered man named Abel Crisp who had known Micah for 7 years and whose eyes moved between them with the particular attention of someone doing arithmetic. After Crisp tipped his hat and moved on, Nellie said quietly, "He doesn't quite believe it." "He's a careful man," Micah said. "What will you tell him if he asks directly?" Micah considered. "The truth, approximately, that you came to manage the household, that we are acquainted. That's a careful word. I'm a careful man." She glanced at him sideways, a quick, assessing look that lasted barely a second but that Micah felt with an unreasonable intensity. "You are," she said. "That's one of the things I noticed first." He did not ask what the other things were. He wanted to, he did not. That evening, riding back to Crescent Ridge in the last of the daylight with the wagon loaded with provisions, Nellie had told him about Kansas City. Not the version from her letter that had been the outline. This was the interior of it. She had been teaching at a school near the Missouri River, 5th and 6th grade, for 4 years. She had loved it genuinely and been, by any objective measure, good at it. The school board chairman, a man named Hargrove who had money, and the self-satisfaction that money untethered from character produces, had decided that Nellie's approach to teaching, which included having students read newspapers and discuss current events alongside their standard lessons, was dangerously progressive. He had also, Nellie said with a flatness that covered something sharp and old, made personal advances that she had rejected clearly and without drama. "He told the board I was unfit," she said, "that I was teaching inappropriate material and undermining community values. 3 board members agreed with him, 2 didn't. I was dismissed." She paused. "He also told several people in the community that my dismissal was for moral reasons, which was untrue and which he knew was untrue." Micah had kept his eyes on the road. "Did you fight it?" "I tried. I wrote letters. I spoke to the county superintendent. Hargrove had more money and more time and more connections than I did, and he was willing to lie and I was not." She looked out at the desert darkening around them. "So I left, went to St. Louis with the intention of finding another teaching position. Found that news travels on the wires faster than women can outrun it. Hargrove had written to contacts in St. Louis." A pause. "I was looking at that advertisement in the newspaper and thinking about how much I wanted clean air and honest work, and the rest of it seemed self-explanatory." "I'm sorry that happened to you," Micah said. "It was a forced choice. I didn't have the resources to keep fighting him." She said it without self-pity, and that was what got him, not the injustice of it, though the injustice of it made him angry in a cold, settled way, but the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of powerlessness without any surrender to bitterness. "I'm not sorry I left. I'm sorry it was necessary." They were quiet for the last 3 miles. When they pulled into the ranch yard and he helped her down from the wagon, her hand in his for 4 seconds. "No more," she said, without preamble. "What happened to Alina?" He went very still. "Rogelio mentioned the name," she said quietly, "not to gossip. He was telling me that the spare room had been repainted 2 years ago and he said the name, then stopped, and I could see he hadn't meant to say it." Micah unhitched the horse without speaking for a long moment. Then he said, "Alina was my wife. She died 2 years ago." Nellie was quiet. "Fever," he said. "It came on fast. She was gone in 8 days." He stopped. "I don't," he stopped again. "You don't have to," Nellie said, and her voice had changed. The practical directness softened by something that felt like genuine care, like she was handling something fragile without drawing attention to the fact that she was handling it. "I just wanted to know what it was, so I don't step on it by accident." He looked at her then, really looked in the lamplight from the open barn door with the horses quiet and the desert dark all around them. "She was 28, he said. We were married for 3 years. She loved this ranch. He paused. I built the east room for her. She never lived to sleep in it. Nellie nodded once with a seriousness that was not pity, that was simply acknowledgement. Then she said, I'll not say anything else about it unless you want to. That's your ground, not mine. He did not know what to do with her. He was not accustomed to people who understood precisely where the lines were and honored them without being asked. He was not accustomed to someone standing in his yard in the lamplight making him feel, for the first time in 2 years, like the house behind him was not just a structure but a home. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she had gone to her room, and he thought about the folded form in his vest pocket. Then he did something that he would spend the next 3 days rationalizing and the rest of his life understanding. He unfolded the marriage license application, took out his pen, and wrote both their names on it in clear, deliberate ink. He did not file it immediately. He told himself he was only preparing it, having it ready, being practical. He had spent 11 years being practical about hard things, and he was simply being practical about this one. He filed it with Abernathy at the county clerk's office on the 6th day of her being at Crescent Ridge. He told Abernathy it was a private matter and asked for discretion. Abernathy, who was not a man well suited to discretion, and who was furthermore excited by the prospect of gossip involving Micah Donnelly, who had been the subject of no gossip whatsoever for 11 years, told Reverend Holt at the end of that same day. Reverend Holt, understanding what a filed marriage license application implied, came to see Micah the following morning with a warm handshake and an offer to perform the ceremony at whatever time was convenient. Micah had told Holt it was premature and asked him not to discuss it. Holt had gone away looking thoughtful, and that evening Nellie had found the application. She had been in the kitchen making supper when she saw the folded paper in Micah's vest pocket. He had hung the vest on the peg near the door, which he always did, and the paper was sticking out of the pocket. She had thought it was the list of supplies they needed, which she had asked him to hold for her. She had pulled it out without thinking, unfolded it, read it, and now she was sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the lamplight, the supper half-made behind her on the stove, her hands flat on the table and the marriage license application lying between them like a verdict. "Tell me from the beginning," she said again, and her voice was steadier now, the shock settling into something harder and more demanding. "Not from when I found the paper. From why?" So he told her. He told her about Alina, more than he had said in the yard, not all of it, not yet, but more. He told her about the 2 years of grief that had been so quiet and so total that he had mistaken it for recovery. He told her about Webb and Daniel and the cold-blooded practicality with which he had first placed the advertisement, and then, and this was where his voice changed, where the careful steadiness cracked just slightly. He told her about reading her letter for the 3rd time and feeling something in his chest shift, like a door that had been sealed shut for 2 years moving slightly on its hinges. "I know what I did was wrong," he said. "I know I did not give you the right to decide. I know I made a plan that involved your life without asking you, and that is exactly the kind of thing you left Kansas City to escape." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not going to excuse it. I'm telling you the truth, which is that I filed that form because somewhere in 6 days I became unable to think clearly about you leaving, and that terrified me enough that I did something preemptive and unilateral and wrong." The silence between them was enormous. Nellie looked at the form on the table. She looked at his hands, which were still now, the hat set aside, his fingers resting flat on the table the way hers were. She thought about Hargrove, who had also made permanent plans involving her life plans to destroy her reputation, to foreclose her choices, to make decisions that stripped her of agency. She thought about the years she had spent being careful, being self-sufficient, building walls against exactly this kind of hidden motive. And then she thought about the difference between a man who makes plans because he wants to control and a man who makes plans because he is afraid of loss. They were not the same thing. They were genuinely not the same thing, and she was honest enough, had always been honest to the point of inconvenience to acknowledge it. "You frightened me," she said. "I know. I have spent 3 years making sure that no one would ever again be able to make decisions about my life as if I wasn't a person whose opinion mattered. I know that too. And then I found that paper, and for one moment it was exactly like," she stopped. "It was like Kansas City, except worse, because I had started to," she stopped again. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, one that was so unguarded it was almost painful to look at. He had stripped away the steadiness, the careful composure, and what was underneath it was simply a man who had looked at someone and recognized something and had been afraid of what would happen when she walked out the door. "Started to what?" he asked quietly. She looked at the paper, then at him. "Started to stop thinking about leaving," she admitted. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove made small sounds. Outside, the New Mexico night was doing what it always did, pressing in close and full of stars and indifferent to human complications. "The license isn't a command," Micah said. "I know that's how it reads. But what I meant," he paused, choosing words with that careful precision she had come to associate with him, that deliberate honesty that she had, without quite realizing it, come to trust. "What I meant was that I wanted to ask you. That I was building toward asking you. And I filed the paper first because I was afraid that if I asked and you said no, you'd leave before I had the chance to tell you why I thought the answer might be yes." She stared at him. "That is," he said slowly, "possibly the most backward logic I have ever employed." "It is absolutely the most backward logic you have ever employed," she said. "You filed a marriage license application as a prelude to asking if I might consider being asked." "Yes. That is genuinely," she pressed her lips together. Something was happening in her chest that she was fighting hard because she was still angry, and she believed the anger was valid, and she was not going to let it be dissolved prematurely by the fact that he was the most forthright, self-aware, quietly devastating man she had met in her entire life. "That is genuinely one of the most ridiculous things I have ever heard. I'm aware. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I had exactly 6 days of knowing you and that somehow those 6 days had changed the geometry of everything I had assumed about the next 20 years of my life, and that I was not equipped to let that happen calmly." She was quiet for a long moment. "Is that the truth?" she asked. "Not the part that sounds good, the actual truth." "Yes. 6 days. Yes." She picked up the paper, looked at both their names written in his clear, deliberate hand. The ink was dark and certain and a little too permanent for something that was supposed to have been so carefully considered. She put it back down. "I need time," she said. "Take it," he said immediately. "Real time, not 6 days. Take whatever you need." She stood up and went back to the stove where supper was waiting and finished making it with her back to him and her thoughts in something that was not quite order but was at least in progress. They ate without talking much. Later, she washed the dishes and he dried them. They had fallen into this habit early without discussing it, and when she went to her room she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her 2 battered bags in the corner of the room. She had not unpacked everything into the wardrobe. She had been leaving options open. She had always been leaving options open. She looked at the bags for a long time. The next morning, Rogelio came to the house early with news that changed the shape of everything again. Webb's men had been seen on the East Road, Rogelio said, 3 of them riding in the direction of Crescent Ridge, armed. Rogelio had been up before dawn checking on the cattle near the eastern pasture and had spotted them from a distance and ridden back fast. Micah was at the table with his coffee when Rogelio came in, and the news straightened his spine and set his jaw in a way that Nellie, coming out of her room at the sound of the rapid knock, had not seen before. He was not afraid. He was calculating. "How long?" he asked Rogelio. "An hour, maybe less," Rogelio said. Micah looked at Nellie. The morning light was coming through the east window and she had her hair down, not yet pinned, and she was in her work dress, and she was looking back at him with the focused attention that meant she was already ahead of the problem. "What do they want?" she asked. "To take stock," Micah said. "Webb sends men to look before he moves. They'll ride in, look around, ask questions, and ride back with a report. He paused. What they're looking for is vulnerability. An isolated man on a large property with no community ties and no family. And if they see a household, Nellie said slowly, a working ranch with, it changes the calculation, Micah said. Significantly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to her room and came back with her hair pinned and her good apron on, and she went to the kitchen and started making breakfast like a woman who had been making breakfast in this kitchen for years, moving with an ease and ownership that was not performance, but was something she was deliberately choosing to make real. Micah watched her do it, and something in his expression shifted to a tenderness so unguarded that Rogelio saw it, looked at the floor, and developed a sudden intense interest in his hat brim. Webb's men arrived at 40 minutes past 8. There were 3 of them hard-faced, well-dressed in the way that men who work for money rather than ranching are well-dressed, with the slightly bored alertness of professionals doing a job. Their leader, a man who gave his name as Coulter, rode up to the yard and called the house from horseback in the way that was customary and waited. Micah came out of the house, and Nellie came out behind him with a dish towel over her arm, which was so natural and so domestic that it would have been impossible to read as staged by anyone who didn't already know. She stood slightly behind his shoulder, close enough to be clearly part of the household, and looked at the visitors with the polite, faintly assessing expression of a woman interrupted during morning work. Coulter's eyes moved over the house, the yard, the well-maintained barn, the horses in the paddock, Rogelio working near the fence, and then to Nellie and back to Micah. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. The conversation was brief. Coulter claimed to be passing through and asked about water for the horses, which was a thin excuse that everyone present understood. Micah directed them to the trough and kept his tone civil and unhurried. After 4 minutes, Coulter and his men rode on, and Micah watched them go until they crested the ridge and disappeared. Then he turned and looked at Nellie. They saw what they needed to see, she said quietly. Yes, and they'll report back to Webb that this is a settled household. Yes, he was looking at her with that steady, dark intensity that she had been trying not to think too hard about. Nellie, don't, she said. Not yet, I'm still thinking. He nodded and went to help Rogelio. She went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled out the letter she had been writing to her sister Margaret in St. Louis. She had written most of it 2 days ago, but she had not finished it, and she looked at the last line she had written. I don't know how long I'll be here. The arrangement is temporary, or it's supposed to be. She crossed out the last sentence. Then she crossed out the one before it too. Then she put the letter away and sat with her hands folded and thought about what she actually wanted. She had been so careful for so long to want nothing that could be taken from her. She had made herself portable, self-sufficient, emotionally mobile, everything packed into 2 bags, everything important kept where she could reach it in a hurry. She had told herself this was freedom. She had told herself that the rootlessness was a kind of sovereignty, a guarantee against the particular trap of needing someone so much that they could destroy you by leaving or forcing you out. But there was another kind of trap, she thought. There was the trap of preemptive retreat, of deciding in advance that everything was temporary, that every room was a departure lounge, that every person who might matter was already in the process of being left behind. Micah Donnelly had filed a marriage license application in the county clerk's office 4 days after meeting her. It was impulsive and presumptuous and completely wrong in its method. It was also, she understood now with a clarity that felt like sunlight coming through a clear window, the act of a man who recognized something real and responded to it with his whole heart before his practical intelligence could stop him. She thought about how he had told her about a leaner, about the East Room built for a woman who never slept in it, about 2 years of quiet grief that he had been carrying alone in a house too large for one person. She thought about clean air and honest work. She had those things here. She had also found something she hadn't advertised for the specific, irreplaceable experience of being known by someone. of having your edges recognized and not flinched from, of a man who listened when you spoke and remembered what you said and thought about it afterward. She was in love with him. She had been trying not to name it, but there it was, sitting in the middle of her careful thoughts, immovable. She went outside. He was at the fence with Rogelio, hammering a post, and he looked up when she came across the yard. She waited until Rogelio, with the discretion of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was gracious about it, found an urgent task at the far end of the fence line. "I have some things to say," Nellie said. "I'm listening," Micah said. He set down the hammer and turned to face her fully. "What you did was wrong. The method was wrong. You owed me the conversation before the action, not after. If there is a we, that has to be understood." "Understood," he said without qualification. "I am not a temporary solution. I am not a strategic asset. If I stay because it's what I want, on terms that include my full participation in decisions that concern my own life." "Yes," he said. "That's the only way I want you to stay. And I am not stepping into a house that belongs to a leaner. If I am here as myself. I respect your grief. I will not minimize it. I need to know that she paused, that this is its own thing, not a replacement." Micah was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and honest in the way she had come to depend on. "Alina was my wife and I loved her, and I will carry that loss for the rest of my life. It doesn't disappear. But she is not here and you are, and what I feel when I look at you is—" He stopped, started again. "It is not what I feel when I remember her. It is something entirely its own. It arrived in 6 days and it has done nothing but grow, and I am not going to pretend it is anything other than what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. "What is it?" "I think you know. I want you to say it." He met her eyes and the steadiness was still there, but the guard was fully down now, and what she saw was so clear and so unprotected that she felt it in her sternum. "I love you, Nellie. I know that's a preposterous thing to say to someone I've known for a week. I know it, and I mean it entirely." She breathed out slowly. "It is a preposterous thing to say. Yes. I am also," she said carefully, "not in a position to tell you you're wrong." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on him that wasn't guarded, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her want to look at it for a very long time. "What does that mean specifically?" he asked. "It means that I'm going to agree to have the conversation about the license, not to agree to it, to have the conversation about it like two adults with full information and mutual respect and no more unilateral filings of legal documents." "Agreed," he said. "And it means," she said more quietly, "that I would like you to move my bags from the corner of my room into the wardrobe." He went still. "Because I've been leaving them packed," she said, "in case I needed to leave quickly, and I don't want to do that anymore." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in him, something that had been holding very carefully closed for 2 years, or maybe longer, simply opened. She could see it happen, the way you can see weather coming across flat land, the shift in the light and the air before the rain. "I'll move them myself," he said. She nodded. "After supper," she said. "We can talk after supper." They talked after supper, and the night before, and the morning after, and a great many more evenings besides. Because the conversation, the real one, the full one, the one that included Alina and Kansas City, and Hargrove and Webb and Daniel, and all the dark past, and the hidden motives, and the forced choices that had brought 2 specific and complicated people to a ranch house 12 miles from Mesilla in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1878, was long and necessary and worth every hour. 2 weeks after Nellie's arrival at Crescent Ridge, Micah wrote a letter to Daniel. He told Daniel to come west, that there would be work for him at the ranch, and that whatever debt he owed Cortland Webb, it would be handled. He also told Daniel, in a single line at the end of the letter, that there was someone he needed to meet. 3 weeks after her arrival, Nellie went to the Thursday sewing circle at Clara Vance's house and came back thoughtful and warm-cheeked from the fire and the conversation. And when Micah asked what she thought of Mesilla, she said, "I think I could teach here." "There's a school," he said. "I know, Clara told me. The current teacher is leaving in the spring. Her husband is being transferred. She looked at him with that sideways assessment. I wrote to the Doña Ana County School Board yesterday for an inquiry about the position. He looked at her. Presumptuous of me, she asked, and there was a lightness in the question that had not been there in the first days, a teasing quality that he was only beginning to learn to hear. Not at all, he said. This is your home. You can write to whoever you like. The word home landed between them simply and without ceremony, and she looked at him with an expression that was so unguarded and so full that he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time. And she kissed him back with all the certainty of a woman who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. Rogelio, who had been crossing the yard toward the house with a question about the cattle count, took one look through the kitchen window and turned around and went back to the barn with a broad and private smile. The question of Webb did not resolve itself quietly, because nothing involving men like Cortlandt Webb ever did. He sent Coulter and another man back to Crescent Ridge a month after the first visit, this time with a written offer to purchase the property at a figure that was slightly below market value, and worded in a way that implied the alternative was unpleasant. Micah read the offer, handed it to Nellie, watched her read it, and then sat down and wrote a response so precise and legally detailed, citing specific territorial statutes regarding coercive land acquisition, and noting the involvement of Sheriff Abel Crisp, who Micah had already spoken to, that, when Coulter read it, his expression shifted from professional to personally annoyed, which was more satisfying than it should have been. Crisp had been quietly building a case against Webb's operations in Doña Ana County for 2 years, and Webb's pressure on Micah, combined with the testimony of 2 other ranchers Webb had successfully pressured into selling below value, gave Crisp what he needed to involve the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. Webb's operation was not destroyed in a single dramatic moment. That was not how such things worked, but the combined legal and official pressure dismantled his leverage methodically over the following months, like a careful removal of teeth. By January of 1879, Webb had relocated his operations north toward Colorado and was someone else's problem. Daniel arrived at Crescent Ridge in early November of 1878, having apparently ridden through 3 territories in 2 weeks with the particular speed of a man putting distance between himself and a debt collector. He was young and lean, and had Micah's dark eyes and a face that was less formed, more open to the world, more likely to be either delighted or alarmed by it. He rode into the yard at mid-morning, swung down from his horse, and stopped when Nellie came out of the house with her apron on and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a direct, assessing expression. He looked at Micah, who had come out behind her. "This is Nellie," Micah said. "She's going to be my wife." It was the first time he had said it out loud without qualification, and Nellie looked at him with an expression that was partly exasperated and partly so warm it was almost physical. "You could have told me first," she said. "I'm telling you now in front of a witness." Daniel looked between them rapidly, processing. Then he put out his hand to Nellie. "Daniel Donnelly, I'm very glad to meet you. Is my brother always this unilateral?" she offered. Daniel's face broke into a grin that was surprisingly charming. "I was going to say confident, but yours is better." "He's working on it," Nellie said, and shook his hand. They were married in January of 1879 at Mesilla's small adobe church, Reverend Holt officiating with a warmth that made it clear he had been looking forward to this since September. The church was full Rogelio and his family, Clara Vance and her husband, Sheriff Crisp, several neighboring ranchers, and most of the town, because Mesilla was small enough that a wedding was a communal event, and this particular one had been anticipated with considerable interest. Nellie wore a dress of deep green wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Santa Fe, practical enough for a frontier woman, beautiful enough to make Micah, standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him down the aisle on Daniel's arm. Look at her, with an expression that Clara Vance later described to 3 separate friends as the most thoroughly undone she had ever seen a man look in a church. She had written to her sister Margaret, who had written back with a letter so warm and so full of relief, because Margaret had been quietly worried about Nellie's self-imposed isolation for 2 years, that Nellie had read it twice and then sat down and cried, which she did not do often. Margaret was in St. Louis with a family of her own and could not make the journey in January, but she sent a wedding gift, a small silver hair comb that had belonged to their mother, wrapped in careful tissue paper with a note that said simply, "Be happy. You are allowed." Nellie wore the comb at her wedding. It sat in her dark auburn hair, above the small cascade of dried desert flowers that Clara had arranged, and when Micah saw it, he did not know what it was, but he could see that it mattered to her, and he remembered it and asked her about it afterward on the evening of their wedding day, when they were finally alone in the house that was now fully theirs. She told him about the comb, about Margaret, about their mother, who had died when Nellie was 17 and Margaret 14, from a fever in a winter that had been hard, about their father, who had been a schoolteacher in Ohio, and had taught both his daughters to read with the conviction that literacy was the only reliable protection against the world's particular cruelties. Micah listened to all of it, lying beside her in the dark of the room he had built for Alina and had given to her, because she had been right about that. This was its own thing. This was entirely separate and new, and the room had become hers the moment he moved her bags into the wardrobe. In the spring, she began teaching at the Mesilla School. The county school board had hired her by December, after a careful review of her credentials and her letter of explanation regarding Kansas City, which Micah had advised her to address directly rather than hoping no one would ask, advice that proved sound. The board chairman was a practical man named Holloway who cared more about competency than gossip, and he hired her on a handshake and told her the school had 42 students in 3 age groups and she could organize them as she thought best. She loved it from the first day. She came home each evening dusty from the road, full of stories about the children, a boy named Tomas who was 11 and mathematically gifted in a way that needed managing, a girl named Ruth who was memorizing poetry at 9 and could recite it back perfectly, a dozen others whose individual natures she cataloged with the precision and genuine affection of someone who understood that children were not generic. Micah listened to her talk about her students every evening across the dinner table and thought, with a regularity that still surprised him, that he could not have imagined this. Not this specific, daily, full-dimensioned life. He had not known to imagine it. In the summer of 1879, Nellie told him she was expecting their first child. They were on the porch in the evening, the sky going that deep violet that New Mexico does better than anywhere, and she told him matter-of-factly, in the way she did everything, and then watched him with those watchful eyes to see how he would receive it. He stood up from his chair, crossed the 2 feet between them, and took her face in his hands the way he had that first night in the kitchen, and he pressed his forehead against hers and stayed there for a long moment without speaking, and she felt the slight tremor in his hands that he would never have allowed if he hadn't decided, thoroughly and finally, that there was no part of himself he needed to guard from her. "Good," he said finally, in a voice that wasn't quite steady. "That's very good." Their son was born in February of 1880, in the middle of the coldest night of that winter, when the wind was doing something extraordinary outside, and the fire in the bedroom was the center of the world. The doctor from Las Cruces, a capable and calm man named Reyes, attended the birth. Daniel had ridden the 12 miles to town at midnight to bring him, arriving with ice on his hat brim and a story about the road conditions that he told for years afterward. They named him Thomas William Donnelly Thomas for Micah's middle name, which had been his grandfather's, and William for Nellie's father, who had taught her to read and had died 3 years before she came to New Mexico, and whom she still missed with the particular, specific ache of someone who understood that what a person teaches you outlives them. Rogelio brought his wife Alina and their 3 children to see the baby the following Sunday, and Alina held Thomas with the easy confidence of a woman who had raised 3 of her own and pronounced him excellent, which was the most favorable review available. Sheriff Crisp came by the following week, holding his hat and looking at the baby with the careful expression of a man unsure about babies but very sure about correct behavior, and said, "Fine boy, looks like a Donnelly." He paused. "You've done well here, both of you." It was a long speech for Crisp, and Nellie thanked him warmly, and Crisp left looking slightly overcome. The Crescent Ridge Ranch grew in the years that followed. Not extravagantly, not with the particular fever of ambition that destroyed many men in the territory, but steadily, the way things grow when someone attends to them with care and knowledge. Micah expanded the cattle operation and added a small horse breeding program that Rogelio managed with the expertise of someone who had grown up around horses in Chihuahua and understood them in a bone-deep way that no amount of book learning could replicate. Daniel, who turned out to be unexpectedly good with finances, handled the ledgers and gradually became Micah's business partner, in fact if not yet in name. Nellie taught at the Mesilla School for 4 years and was the best teacher they had ever had, which was the consensus of parents, students, and the school board alike. When Thomas was 3, old enough for the mornings to be manageable, she returned to teaching part-time. And when Ruth, yes, the same Ruth who had been memorizing poetry at 9, grew up and came back to Mesilla as a trained teacher herself, she told Nellie directly that Nellie was the reason she had pursued education, which made Nellie set down her coffee cup and look out the window for a moment in the way she did when something moved her that she needed to process privately. The war between self-sufficiency and love was one that Nellie won by understanding, finally, that she had been fighting the wrong battle. Self-sufficiency was not incompatible with love. Being rooted was not the same as being trapped. The 2 bags in the corner of the room had been unpacked into the wardrobe, and she had never once wanted to repack them. That was not weakness. It was the evidence of a choice freely made, and she had made it with her whole self, and it had turned out to be exactly what she wanted it to be. She wrote to Margaret every month. Margaret came to visit in the summer of 1882, crossing the country by rail and arriving at the Mesilla station with 3 of her own children, and a husband named Gerald who was pleasant and slightly overwhelmed by New Mexico. And the 2 sisters spent 2 weeks catching up on 5 years of separation that no amount of letters had fully bridged. Margaret walking back from the school one afternoon with Nellie while Thomas ran ahead in the road and the air smelled of dust and heat and the particular dry sweetness of the territory in summer, looked at her sister and said, "You're happy." "Yes," Nellie said simply, "really happy, really happy." Margaret nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman seeing the resolution of something she had worried about for years. "Good," she said. "It suits you." In 1883, when Thomas was 3 years old and beginning to develop a personality that mixed Micah's stubbornness with Nellie's precision, in a combination that they found simultaneously admirable and exhausting, Nellie told Micah she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table in the morning, over coffee, in the same direct way. He looked up from the ledger he was reviewing, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the careful composure falling away to something so open and so full that she thought, as she thought regularly, that she could look at him for the rest of her life without the looking ever becoming ordinary. "How far along?" he asked. 4 months, probably." "You waited 4 months to tell me." "I wanted to be certain." She said it evenly. "And I was curious how long it would take you to notice on your own." He blinked. He paused. "Did I notice?" "You told me twice in the last month that I looked beautiful, and both times you had an expression on your face like you were doing arithmetic you couldn't quite solve. So no, you didn't notice. You just had a feeling." He put down his pen and looked at her with that combination of exasperation and deep affection that was the specific temperature of their love, warm and honest and occasionally frustrating and never dull. "You are the most what?" "The most extraordinary person I have ever known," he said, and meant it. And she knew he meant it, and she reached across the table and took his hand and held it. Their second child was a girl, born in the winter of 1883, healthy and loud, and decided about her opinions from her first moments. They named her Margaret Eleanor Margaret for the sister who had told Nellie she was allowed to be happy, Eleanor for the woman who had loved this ranch, and who deserved to be remembered not as a shadow, but as a part of its history. Nellie had suggested the middle name herself, and Micah had looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded, with the particular, careful gratitude of a man who understands that grief and love are not competing forces. The East Room, the room Micah had built for Eleanor and given to Nellie, became the nursery when Thomas outgrew the small crib and needed a proper bed. Nellie repainted it herself, with Thomas helping in the way 3-year-olds help, which is to say enthusiastically and approximately. The walls became a soft yellow, which was nothing like what it had been before, and that felt correct. Daniel found his own story in 1882, a full and worthy account in its own right, when he met a woman named Josephine Keene at a cattle auction in Las Cruces. Josephine was the daughter of a rancher, and had an opinion about cattle pricing that she expressed directly to the auctioneer and then to the room. And Daniel, who had spent 4 years watching his brother love a woman of exactly that quality, recognized something immediately and introduced himself before the auction was half over. Micah, who was also at the auction, watched his brother do it and thought that some things ran in families in ways you did not expect. Daniel and Josephine were married in 1883 and settled on a portion of the eastern Crescent Ridge land that Micah had offered Daniel as a partnership arrangement, because 2 families working the land made better sense than one, and because Daniel had earned it. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly and not quickly, but with a fullness that makes every ordinary moment weighty without feeling heavy. The seasons at Crescent Ridge were distinct and dramatic. The spring when the desert bloomed in a color riot that never failed to astonish anyone who hadn't grown up with it. The summer of heat and brilliant sky. The autumn when the air changed, and the light went golden and particular. The winter of cold and stars, and the fire in the main room that Micah kept burning on every cold night because Nellie loved it. In 1885, the railroad came through Doña County proper, cutting a line that brought the territory closer to the rest of the country in ways that were sometimes welcome and sometimes not. Mesilla changed, grew, gained new businesses, new people, new complications. The school doubled its enrollment. Nellie applied for a second classroom and a second teacher and got both, and spent a year training the new teacher, a young man just arrived from Texas named Pierce who was earnest and competent and slightly terrified of Nellie's standards, which he eventually met. Thomas started school at 6 and was, by any honest assessment, a handful. He had inherited his father's tenacity and his mother's refusal to accept information without understanding it, which meant that he asked more questions than his teachers were always prepared for, and had to be given extra reading to keep him occupied. Micah sat with him in the evenings and went over his lessons with him in the way that men do when they have been self-educated in difficult circumstances and want something different for their children, not better in a dismissive sense, but more, wider, with more doors open. Margaret Eleanor, called Maggie almost immediately by everyone including her parents, was the kind of small child who has already decided about the world and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. She followed Rogelio around the ranch yard from the time she could walk steadily, with a focused interest in the horses that was clearly going to become something. By 5 she could name every horse on the property and had opinions about their personalities that were, when checked, accurate. Rogelio regarded her with a warm and private pride, and Elena Vargas brought her little embroidered gloves for her birthday that Maggie wore until they fell apart. The Cortland Webb business was never entirely forgotten. These things leave marks on the landscape of a life whether you want them to or not, but it lost its sharpness over the years. The specific fear of being a solitary man on a large property, vulnerable to the kind of coercive darkness that Webb represented, had been replaced by something so different in texture and character that Micah sometimes thought about his 33-year-old self, standing alone in the kitchen with a marriage license application in his hands, and felt a complicated mix of gratitude and compassion for the man he had been, afraid of exactly the right things for the wrong reasons, and fortunate enough to have been wrong about them. He had expected a temporary arrangement. He had made permanent plans before the week was out, and the permanent plans had been, against all probability, correct. There was a night in the summer of 1886 when Thomas was 6 and Maggie was 2 and the air was warm, and the stars were doing what New Mexico stars do, which is to make the sky look like a conversation about infinity, when Micah and Nellie sat on the porch after the children were asleep. This was a habit they had kept from the beginning: the porch in the evening, the day reviewed and set aside, the particular quiet of two people who did not need to fill silence. Nellie had her feet up on the porch rail and her hair loose down her back, which she only did at home, and she was looking at the stars with the expression she got when she was thinking about something large and not particularly urgent. Micah had his coffee and was looking at the yard, the dark outlines of the barn and the paddock, the glow of lantern light from Rogelio's house at the east edge of the property, where Rogelio and Alina had lived for 8 years now. "Do you remember," Nellie said without preamble, "what I wrote in that letter, the first letter, the one from the newspaper advertisement?" "Yes," he said. "I said I wasn't looking for permanence." "You said you'd had enough of being someone else's permanent plan." She turned her head and looked at him. "You remember the exact words." "I read the letter 4 times," he said. "I remember every word of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that, about what I meant when I wrote it." She looked back at the stars. "I think I meant that I didn't want someone else to decide what my life looked like, to make plans that assumed my agreement without asking for it." She paused. "And then you went and filed a marriage license before you asked me, and I thought it was exactly that, exactly the same thing." "I know, but it wasn't," she said. "Not really. Because Hargrove made plans about my life because he wanted to diminish it, because I was inconvenient to him, and his plans were about removing me as an obstacle." She looked at him. "Your plan was about refusing to let me disappear. That's—" She paused. "That's entirely different." Micah was quiet for a moment. "I should still have asked first." "Yes," she agreed. "You absolutely should have. And if you ever file legal documents about my life again without discussing it with me first, I will be genuinely angry." "Understood." "But," she said, and the warmth in that word was everything, "I'm glad you couldn't wait. I'm glad you were that afraid of me leaving." "Because I was afraid too, and if you'd been patient and correct about it, we might both have been so careful that nothing happened at all." He set down his coffee and reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his in the easy, certain way of two people who have been doing this for years and could do it in the dark. "8 years ago I wrote an advertisement for a housekeeper," he said. "What I got was—" "Don't say a wife," she said. "That sounds like I'm a category. I was going to say the person who turned out to be the architecture of my whole life." He paused. "But that might be too dramatic." "It might be just dramatic enough," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice without looking at it. They sat there in the warm dark, and the stars did their thing, and the house behind them held their sleeping children, and Rogelio's lantern made a warm point of light in the east, and the land stretched out in every direction. 400 acres of New Mexico territory that Micah had built and Nellie had made into a home, and their children would inherit with the assumption that land and love and work were things you took care of because they were worth caring for. In 1887, Nellie discovered she was expecting again. She told Micah at the kitchen table, as she always did in the morning over coffee. He was 39 by then and she was 36, and they had been married for 8 years and known each other for 8 years and 1 week approximately. He looked up from the range reports, and his face did the thing it always did, the composure falling away to something so full and open that she had never, in 8 years, stopped finding it extraordinary. Then he said, "You're not going to make me guess this time." "I did not make you guess," she said. "I let you sit with a feeling for 4 months. That," he said, "is exactly making me guess." She laughed. He loved her laugh, had always loved it. From the first time he heard it in the second week of her being at the ranch, when Rogelio had made a dry joke about the fence posts, and she had laughed with her whole face, completely unself-conscious, and Micah had registered it the way you register a frequency you didn't know you'd been listening for. Their third child was another boy. They named him James Rogelio Donnelly James for no specific reason, except that it suited him, and Rogelio for the man who had been present at the building of this family from the beginning, who had seen Micah fall in love before Micah had admitted it, and who had been discreet and dignified about it, and had been a fixture of this family's life for 15 years by the time this new Donnelly arrived in the world. When Micah rode to Rogelio's house to tell him the baby's name, Rogelio stood on his porch and looked at Micah for a long moment and then looked away, with the expression of a man who has received something he considers himself underdeserving of. Then he said, very quietly, "That is a fine name." And then he went inside, and Micah heard Elena Vargas exclaim something in Spanish that he did not fully catch but which had the unmistakable sound of joy. By the time James was 2, Thomas was 9 and could ride any horse on the property, and had developed a reading habit so voracious that Nellie kept writing to the bookseller in Santa Fe for new material. Maggie was 5 and had an absolute relationship with the horses that was becoming clear would be a lifelong thing. She could communicate with them in a way that Rogelio watched with the quiet recognition of someone seeing a real talent emerge. The ranch ran well. The county was more settled now, the wild edges of the territory tamer than they had been, though the land itself, the red dust, the high sky, the particular scale of it, remained exactly what it had always been. One evening in 1889, Nellie sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a long letter to her sister Margaret. It was a letter about ordinary things, Thomas's latest infatuation with anything written about natural science, Maggie's progress with the horses, James's habit of following his father around the ranch yard with the focused attention of a very small person learning a very large thing, the new section of fencing on the north pasture, the excellent year for the cattle operation, the school in Mesilla, which was flourishing, and the way Mesilla itself was growing in ways that were complicated and interesting and required continuous attention. She wrote about Micah last. She wrote about the way he still turned to look at her when she came into a room after 11 years. About the fact that he still remembered the exact words of her first letter, which she had confirmed one evening by asking him to recite it, which he had done, word for word. She wrote about the porch evenings and the morning coffee, and the way he had of sitting with difficult things quietly, and then addressing them directly, which had turned out to be one of the most useful qualities a person could have in a long partnership. She wrote about the east room that was now the nursery, painted yellow, where their children had grown from small and dependent to large and loud and full of their own ideas. She wrote, "I told you, years ago, that I wasn't looking for permanence. I have thought about that often. What I understand now is that I was right about what I didn't want, the kind of permanence that is imposed rather than chosen, that is a trap rather than a home. What I found was the other kind entirely, the kind that is a daily choice, that is the accumulation of all the small decisions, to stay in the conversation instead of retreating, to unpack the bags instead of leaving them by the door, to say the difficult true thing and trust that it will be received. This is what permanence feels like when it's right. It doesn't feel like a closed door. It feels like a direction you keep choosing to go in." She posted the letter on a Thursday when she rode into Mesilla for school. Margaret wrote back 6 weeks later with a letter full of warmth, and the news that her oldest daughter was engaged to a young man from Ohio whom Margaret approved of, and with a single line at the very end. I always knew that story would turn out well. At Crescent Ridge, the autumn of 1889 was the way autumn always was, the air cooling at last, the light going at that particular low angle, the cattle moving well in the changed weather, the children ranging freely in a yard that was more familiar to them than any other ground in the world would ever quite be. Micah stood on the porch one late afternoon watching Thomas and Maggie and James doing complicated things near the paddock that involved a rope and a fence post and disagreement about the correct procedure, and Nellie came out and stood beside him and looked at the same scene. Thomas is going to be a rancher, Micah said. Thomas is going to be whatever he decides to be, Nellie said. But yes, probably a rancher. Maggie is going to do something with the horses. Without question. Rogelio says she has a gift. And James is going to follow me around for about 6 more years and then form opinions I will have to work to respect. Nellie laughed. That's the most accurate prediction you've ever made. They stood there together in the cooling air, watching their children argue productively about rope technique, with the house behind them solid and the land in front of them known, and the sky above them doing what it always did, going enormous and dark and spectacular in the way of skies over flat country, where you can see the whole arc from one horizon to another. 11 years before, Micah Donnelly had placed an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper for a temporary housekeeper, driven by a practical need and a secret fear, and a vague, half-acknowledged ache for something he had stopped allowing himself to imagine. Nellie Ralston had answered the advertisement because she needed clean air and honest work and the freedom to be herself, and had specifically not been looking for anything that involved staying. She was supposed to be temporary. He had made permanent plans before the week was out. They were, on the evidence of 11 years and 3 children, and an evening routine that neither of them would trade for anything in the known world, both entirely at peace with how that had worked out. "Come inside," Nellie said. "Supper's ready. 5 minutes," he said. She looked at him with the expression she had been developing for 11 years, the one that combined fondness with a very precise understanding of what 5 minutes meant in practice. "Thomas," she called out to the yard, "tell your father supper is ready and he is to come inside now." Thomas looked up from the rope situation. "Papa," he called. "Mama says now." Micah looked at Nellie. She met his look with something that was part amusement, part love, and wholly particular to her. The combination he had known the first time he saw it in the lamplight of the depot at Mesilla, when she had climbed down from the stage and walked directly to where he was standing and introduced herself without waiting. He had known, even then, somewhere underneath all the practicality and the careful distance he was maintaining. He had known. He went inside. She came in behind him, and the door closed, and the lamp in the window made a warm light in the darkening yard, and the children came running across the dust toward the house, making the noise that children make when called in from outside, that reluctant, abundant noise full of their entire selves. And the New Mexico sky went on doing what it always did, indifferent and magnificent above Crescent Ridge. Thomas Donnelly, 9 years old, slid into his chair at the kitchen table with his hair full of dust, and his eyes bright with the energy of a person who has been arguing outdoors and would like to continue the argument at supper, and looked at his parents. "Mama," he said, "what's the rope with the best tensile strength for a weight-bearing application on a fence post?" Nellie sat down and served the potatoes without missing a beat. "Braided hemp properly maintained. Why, Maggie said cotton was better." "Maggie is wrong," Nellie said. "Braided hemp. Ask Rogelio to show you the difference tomorrow." Thomas looked triumphant. Maggie looked outraged. James, who had been watching this exchange from his chair with the intense focus of a 2-year-old processing the world at high speed, said hemp, very carefully, which was clearly not a word he had encountered before, and then looked at it from several angles silently. Micah Donnelly sat at the head of his table with his wife on his left and his children around him in the lamplight. And the supper was good, and the conversation was loud, and the house was full of all the particular beautiful noise of a life being lived. And he thought, with a completeness and a gratitude that needed no words, that he had been exactly right about everything that mattered. The temporary arrangement had held for eternity. That was the plan. That was always the plan.